There is a specific, agonizing kind of silence that precedes a catastrophe. It is not peaceful. It is heavy, suffocating, and pregnant with the violence of things left unsaid. For years, I had cultivated this exact silence within the walls of my own home, mistakenly believing it to be a shield. I was an academic, an archivist of history, convinced that if I simply kept my head down and recorded the facts, the churning, rusted gears of the Republic's political machine would grind past my doorstep without snagging my life in their teeth. But neutrality, I would soon learn, is a luxury bought entirely with the blood of others. And eventually, the bill comes due. The geography of a fractured home. Marriage is rarely destroyed by a single seismic event. It is eroded by 1,000 tiny, unaddressed compromises. When Julian and I first spoke our vows, the world was softer. We were united by a shared vision of the future, built on the premise of art, literature, and quiet evenings. But as the new chancellor's authoritarian grip tightened on the city, as curfews replaced evening strolls and neighbors began vanishing in the dead of night, our home slowly transformed into a microcosm of the collapsing state. Politics ceased to be something we read about in the morning papers. It became a third entity living in our house, sitting between us at the dinner table, breathing down our necks. Julian chose the path of perilous pragmatism. He accepted a lucrative, insulated position within the Ministry of Information, arguing with a desperate sort of logic that the only way to survive a flood was to build a boat from the regime's own timber. "We can do more good from the inside," he would say, adjusting his newly tailored, state-issued lapel pin. "I am protecting us." I chose the illusion of distance. I watched from the upstairs window, recording the slow, methodical death of our civic freedoms in my encrypted journals. I told myself that bearing witness was a noble act. I convinced myself that by remaining an observer, by refusing to wear their pins or chant their slogans, I was keeping my soul intact. It was a coward's comfort, and Julian knew it. The ideological chasm between us widened until we were strangers sharing a bed. Our conversations became minefields. A remark about the rising price of bread was no longer just about inflation. It was a veiled critique of the ministry's agricultural seizures. A delay in the train schedule was a reminder of the military blockades. We stopped speaking of the future because we realized we were no longer envisioning the same world. The weight of complicity. The true horror of living under a tyrannical regime is not just the fear of the secret police, it is the realization of how quickly ordinary people will adapt to the darkness if it means keeping their own lights on. I watched Julian adapt. I watched the sharp, empathetic man I married slowly blunt his own conscience. It began with justifications, signing off on censorship mandates to prevent public panic. It escalated to attending lavish ministry galas while the outer district starved. I was his anchor to humanity, the quiet, compliant spouse who provided him with the moral cover he desperately needed. By staying with him, by pouring the wine and smiling at his colleagues, I was silently validating his choices. An observer is merely a participant who lacks the courage to admit their role in the play. This thought haunted me every time I looked in the mirror. I was no longer just a bystander. My inaction was a form of complicity. The ink on my fingers from my secret journals felt less like a badge of honor and more like the stain of guilt. I was documenting the fire while refusing to throw a single bucket of water on the flames. The catalyst. Every person has a breaking point, a microscopic fracture in the psyche where the weight of cognitive dissonance becomes too heavy for the human mind to bear. Mine arrived with a mundane Tuesday afternoon, smelling of ozone and burning paper. I had gone to the city square to purchase ink. The air was tense, Whispers of a peaceful demonstration led by university students had been circulating for days. When I arrived, the square was already surrounded by the ministry's enforcers. What followed was not a riot, but a slaughter. I stood frozen behind a stone pillar as the enforcers advanced on the unarmed students. I watched the brutal, methodical efficiency of the state breaking its own children. I saw a young girl, no older than 19, clutching a banned book to her chest as she was dragged screaming toward the black transport vehicles. But it was not the violence that broke me. It was the face of the man commanding the enforcers from the balcony of the overlooking municipal building. It was Julian. He looked entirely detached, a clipboard in his hand, casually directing the clearance of the square as if he were organizing a warehouse. There was no conflict in his eyes, no hesitation. He had not just survived the flood, he had become the current. In that frozen, agonizing second, the last thread connecting me to my past self snapped. The husband I loved was dead, replaced by an architect of suffering. The marriage was a hollowed-out shell, a ghost ship floating on a sea of rationalizations. And my journals, my precious passive observations, were absolutely worthless. You cannot write poetry to a firing squad. You cannot document a monster out of existence. The path inevitable. I did not return home that evening. I walked away from the affluent, state-protected neighborhood, away from the quiet study, away from the life of the invisible archivist. I walked toward the smog-choked alleys of the lower districts, where the whispered resistance was rumored to hide. The transition from observer to warrior is not a glorious metamorphosis. It is a shedding of skin, leaving you raw, terrified, and painfully awake. It is the terrifying acceptance that peace is no longer an option, and that love, when warped by political rot, can become the very chain that binds you to oppression. I slipped my wedding ring off my finger and dropped it into a storm drain. It landed with a dull, final clink in the dark water below. I had spent my entire life trying to stay out of the arena, mistakenly believing that the audience is safe from the lions. But the stadium is locked, and the stands are burning. Tomorrow, they will come looking for the missing archivist. Tomorrow, Julian will realize his quiet, passive spouse has become his most dangerous adversary. I am done watching the world burn from behind the glass. It is time to pick up a torch.